Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Yes, Roger's Cheap Old Book Club for 2025. This is, I think, the third year. I think this is the third year. I think. My memory's a little fuzzy, but I think it's the third year we're doing this, where Roger over there, great literary critic Roger, will pick out 11 books for the year. And every month starting in February, we will read once a month a book from Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, the cheapest book club around. You're welcome to join us. All these books are available for free on Project Gutenberg and probably other places as well. So yeah, about as cheap as you can get. And physical copies of these books are all available, where you can get them at least, although sometimes they're just going to be cheap print-on-demand copies because of the nature of the books Roger chooses. Roger frequently chooses books that are they're all old, obviously, and in the public domain. And very often, although not always, they're kind of obscure. And if they're not obscure, they are probably not read all that often. A lot of these books you don't hear talked about very often on BookTube, for example. Sometimes a little here and there. Last year we closed out with Herman Melville's Typee, which was one of my favorite books from last year. It was one of the best books I read last year. And I do hear that book talked about here and there, but not very often. And certainly it's overshadowed by Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which is understandable since that was a better book. But still, it was a good enough book that you'd think more people would read and talk about it. But that's the way it goes. And so what are Roger's Cheap Old Book Club picks for this year? I did put up, at the end of the last year, I think, a short, one of those YouTube shorts that I almost never do. I put one of those up on my channel that just gives you the titles of the books. But let's actually talk about the books that we're reading this year. I've got my list of Roger's Cheap Old Book Club this year, starting this month, because it's already February somehow. How'd that happen? Now, some of these books, I've got it with me here physically. I've got a physical copy of all these books, but I'm too lazy to go down the hallway and actually get all of the books. I'm too lazy. I can't expect to be expected to go down the hallway and do this myself. Wilkins! My valet Wilkins is no help. Ever since he's become an undead vampire and, refuses to work during the day, he's been almost worthless. Almost. I have to get up way before the crack of dawn just so he could put my clothes on, Wilkins. Anyway, where were we? Let's talk about the books, shall we? February, for this month, the first book for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club this year is The Spy. It's The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper, and this is my old-timey copy of The Spy, which is suitable for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. This is from the author of the Leatherstocking Saga, he who wrote all of those Deerstalker books, like The Last of the Mohicans. So he also wrote other stuff, and he wrote this, The Spy, which is a novel of the Revolutionary War, which I've never read, even though I've had this ancient copy sitting on my shelf for quite some time. It's not really ancient. When was this published? 1924. So it's only 100 years old, And it has illustrations by C. Leroy Baldridge. C. Leroy Baldridge does the illustrations for this book. So this is going to be something I'm going to be reading. I'm reading Doc Savage right now, because, I'm into the great literature. But as soon as I'm done with the Doc Savage pulp story I'm reading, I'm gonna read this for this month's Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. And you are welcome to join me. You can get it for free, right now, instantly, pretty much. So yeah, The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. I really don't know much about it. because I've never read it. But if it's anything like his Leatherstocking Tales, then it's probably really entertaining. Because if nothing else, Cooper tends to be entertaining. So we will see how The Spy turns out. Revolutionary War, American Revolutionary War. I know other countries have revolutions, but, you know, this is ours. James Fenimore Cooper, The Spy. So there you go. In March, we're going to be reading a book from one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time. Certainly one of the most influential fantasy writers of all time. Had a big influence on J.R.R. Tolkien and so many other writers. That would be Lord Dunsany, and this is The King of Elfland's Daughter. The King of Elfland's Daughter. This is the old Ballantine fantasy, adult fantasy series copy of The King of Elfland's Daughter. There have been a number of editions of this, but this is the one that I have. And Lord Dunsany is incredibly influential. He became popular for a series of short books that collected short fiction, short fantasy stories, which had a huge influence, including on H.P. Lovecraft. But this is an actual novel from Dunsany. So this is The King of Elfland's Daughter. It's supposed to be really good. I feel like I read this, but it must have been when I was a teenager, because I really don't remember much about this. But I'm going to be reading it in March. So there you go, The King of Elfland's Daughter. This is just a really cool copy. This is a cool old book. So there you go. The next one, I'm going to have to flash up a picture. I actually have this in kind of an omnibus volume from Bram Stoker, because this is the Jewel of the Seven Stars by Bram Stoker, which is a kind of Egyptian reincarnation story, I think. I've never read this book, actually. I thought I had for a while, but then I thought, no, I don't think I have read this. I've read other, you know, of course, Dracula is one of my favorite books of all time. And Lair of the White Worm, I've read that silly book. I've got to read that again. I've got to reevaluate that story, because I remember it being a little ridiculous. But maybe I'd like it better if I read it again. And of course, I've read Dracula's Guest, that wonderful collection of short stories. But this is the Jewel of the Seven Stars, which I think they made a film or two off of this, I think. It's been reprinted numerous times. And I think it's one of those books that has more than one ending, I think. I think there was like a revised ending to this. Tell me if I'm wrong, somebody who knows. But this is a book I've been curious about. One of those Bram Stoker books that is not read that often. And, you know, so yeah, there you go. Bram Stoker's The Jewel of the Seven Stars. We will see how that is. The next one is going to be fun, and this is coming in May, which coincidentally, not so coincidentally, is the time when we celebrate Horror Mayhem over here on BookTube. And that would be the very first issue of the incredible pulp magazine Weird Tales, the first issue of Weird Tales. This is a reproduction, which I got a while ago. I think you could still get this probably from a bunch of different print-on-demand publishers. But this is the first issue of Weird Tales, and this is available on Project Gutenberg and a lot of other places, because it's all in the public domain. It's so old. So Weird Tales is legendary. It's the magazine where H.P. Lovecraft first published his stories, and also Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. And so many great writers submitted stories and had their stories published by Weird Tales. Manly Wade Wellman, Ray Bradbury, so many. You know, it's Robert Bloch, so many. This doesn't have any of these, but it does have Ooze. It does have Ooze. An extraordinary novelette by Anthony M. Rudd. A Tale of 1,000 Thrills. Complete in this issue, which is handy for us, since we're reading this in May for Horror Mayhem. So yeah, Weird Tales #1. And this is pretty cool, you know. Facsimile edition, which reprints Weird Tales as it was, with including all of these cool advertisements. I do have. I probably will continue to read Weird Tales after this in May, because I do have electronic copies of all the rest of the issues of Weird Tales, which were, which I acquired by magic, thanks to Roger. But this one I have a cheapo print on demand physical copy of. So Weird Tales #1, the first issue. That's going to be cool. So there's that for May and Horror Mayhem. Then we have June, in a book that is appropriate for June on the Range. And I have this somewhere boxed away. I'm going to have to find it. And this is The Virginian by Owen Wister. The Virginian, a very, very famous Western novel. One of the books that popularized the American West in fiction. And I remember it. I read this so many years ago that I barely remembered. I remembered it was good. I remember it was good. That's all I remember basically about this book, because I must have been 13 or 14 when I read it and haven't picked it up since. But incredibly popular Western. It was made into films. I think it was made into a television show, although I could be wrong. But yeah, The Virginian by Owen Wister, which will be perfect for June on the Range. A fantastic reading event where we read Westerns. So there you go. It's The Virginian. And this next one in July, which is coincidentally, Roger, Rocket Summer, a reading event where we read classic science fiction. In July is The Moon Pool by Abraham Merritt. The Moon Pool. So Merritt was very, very popular. He wrote science fiction, but it really borders on fantasy. So he's an author of science fiction and fantasy, and you don't hear him talked about too much anymore. This is probably his most famous book, The Moon Pool. I have this exact copy somewhere. It's in a box somewhere. I have to find it before July. But it's a really interesting book. I remember it being a lot of fun. I remember it being really weird. It originated as a short story, which Lovecraft thought was superior to the novel version. But then Merritt expanded it into a novel, which was really a bizarre story. And I think this is one of his most popular works. Probably out of all of his books, it's the most well-known and probably the most influential. But he wrote a bunch of stuff, and it was extremely popular. But he's one of those writers you just don't hear about very often. So we're going to read The Moon Pool in July. The Moon Pool. Then we come to August, where we're going to read a book I have right here. It's The People of the Mist by H. Rider Haggard. H. Rider Haggard, probably best known for other works like She. She was one of his very popular books. And he wrote the Alan Quatermain series of books. So, yeah, very popular writer from Victorian England. And this is The People of the Mist. He's popular. He became popular through a series of books that were kind of lost race novels, the lost race or the lost world kind of story. Haggard wrote a lot of that. Excellent adventure writer. He actually spent a lot of time in Africa. So when he talks about Africa, he talks with a little bit more, when he writes about Africa, he writes with a little bit more authority than, say, Edgar Rice Burroughs in his Tarzan books, who never went to Africa at all. But he wrote, fantastic stories. They're basically fantasies, science fiction, adventure, fantasy stories. And this one I know next to nothing about. Another Ballantine adult fantasy, although this one must have been at the bottom of a pile somewhere because it's really cocked, this poor thing. It's probably sitting under a pile of books for years and years and years before I got my hands on it. But it'll still be perfectly readable, and it's something that you can get for free. It's a good size, this one. 365 pages, good sized book. So this should be interesting. And that will be in August. And then in September is a book I'm really looking forward to reading again because I haven't read this one since I was a kid. And that's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle, which I do have. I have this very copy, but it's in the other room. And, you know, I don't want to go over there and get it myself. So here's a picture. I'm so lazy. You know, Wilkins! Damn that Wilkins. Sleeping in the daytime in his coffin. Not getting me my books. But anyway, this is Robin Hood. And there are so many different versions of the Robin Hood story. But this was a very, very popular one. And Howard Pyle was an illustrator. And this edition of this book, it has all of his illustrations in it, which you want, because that's part of the joy of reading this book. I read this book probably when I was 12. My stepfather had a copy of this book, and I read it probably a few times back when I was a kid. And I remember loving the movie too, the old Robin Hood movie, The Adventures of Robin Hood. So yeah, I'm going to read it again as a senior citizen. The Adventures of Robin Hood from Howard Pyle. And that is in September. In October, appropriately enough for Occult Detective October, it's time to read John Silence from Algernon Blackwood. So this edition of John Silence is the Dover edition, which has an extra story in it, I believe. It originally was published, this book was published as John Silence, Physician Extraordinary, about an occult detective. More or less, he was an occult detective. He investigated the paranormal. And these are great stories. It was a very popular book. This one, again, not a book I hear talked about very often, but I remember this being pretty excellent. I've, of course, read these stories. I've read this very copy before, but going to read it again in October because it's been a number of years. And, you know, it's awesome, and you should read it. If you like classic horror, definitely if you like classic horror, this is a book for you. John Silence in October, appropriately enough. And in November, Gulliver of Mars. It's Gulliver of Mars by Edwin L. Arnold, also known as Lieutenant Gulliver Jones, also known as Lieutenant Gulliver Jones, His Vacation, because he took a vacation on Mars. This is very often cited as being a book that influenced the creation of the Martian series by Edgar Rice Burroughs. But we don't actually know for sure that Edgar Rice Burroughs read this book. And so there's a bit of a controversy. Did this book actually influence Edgar Rice Burroughs in his writing of A Princess of Mars, the first of the Martian stories? I don't know, but reading this book, there are a lot of things in this book that make you think, this seems pretty familiar. It makes you think that maybe Edgar Rice Burroughs did read this book, but there's simply no evidence, there's no proof, it wasn't found in his library. He never talked about it, so who knows? Who knows if he read it or not? But it is certainly a curiosity, and from what I remember, an interesting book. I read this years ago, and I'm looking forward to reading it again. A long-lost classic of Martian adventure. And we've got a great cover there by Frazetta, a Frank Frazetta cover, which is awesome. But yeah, you can get this for free on Project Gutenberg. There are other editions of this, including really, really cheap print-on-demand ones. But this is the one I like because of the Frazetta cover. I mean, look at that, this old Ace edition. Fantastic. So yeah, this is going to be in November. And then we're going to close out the year with the book that's in the other room, which is Amu by Herman Melville. I think it's Amu. I think that's how you pronounce it. This is actually the sequel to Typee, which is the book we read last December. So appropriately enough, in December, we're going to be reading Amu by Herman Melville. This is one I don't know much about at all. But if it's anywhere close to being as good as Typee was, I will be very happy with it. Another of his early novels, this is his second novel that he wrote and published, I believe. And so, yeah, Amu, we're going to be reading that in December. And I'm hoping it's as good as Typee. We'll see. It's Melville. It's got to be good, right? It's got to be good. So those are Roger's picks for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. I hope you join us and pick some of these books up. And I will catch you next time.